Well, hey folks, it's your old pal, King Waspinator. Thought it might be fun to go through my entire movie collection on Amazon. It's kind of a neat little trip through time since they're all ordered in the order in which they're purchased. So going all the way back to the year 2013, the very first thing that I purchased on Amazon for VOD, as you can see, is Thor: The Dark World. Ironically, when this movie came out and for several years afterwards, it was considered to be one of the worst of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. But all these years later, looking back on it, especially with the post-Endgame phase of Marvel films, Thor: The Dark World is more of a mid-tier Marvel movie. It at least has some essential plot beats that you need to have seen to understand the greater story arcs of both Thor and the Avengers films leading up to Infinity Gauntlet. Alright, the next thing I got was Spider-Man 2 with Tobey Maguire. Now, the first Spider-Man movie came out. It was alright. I remember having it on VHS at the very tail end of the days of collecting movies on VHS, but I never bothered watching either of its sequels for a long time. But because so many people on the internet kept saying that they thought Spider-Man 2 was this fantastic fucking movie, I went ahead and bought it so I can see it for myself and make up my own mind, and it was alright, I guess. Doc Ock was probably used better in the Tom Holland Spider-Man movie than he was used in this version of Spider-Man. I mean, yeah, it was just a movie. When these movies came out, I hadn't really, embraced comic book films as some sort of, essential genre. It was more a product of just being inundated with so many MCU movies in a row, where finally I was like, fuck it, I guess I'll be into these for a while. But there was always kind of a hesitancy and skepticism I had towards them, which I feel has borne fruit in recent years as the genre kind of starts to deflate. Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Possibly overrated, but just barely. Just barely. At the time, it was rather interesting to see a Marvel movie designed to feel like The Bourne Supremacy or one of the Daniel Craig James Bond movies, and so from that angle it seemed fresh. But it's not one I've ever felt particularly drawn to go back to and review. The Incredible Hulk with Ed Norton, technically an MCU movie, largely ignored, has become more relevant recently because of events in Captain America 4, so I guess it's got that going for it. I liked the moodiness of the Ang Lee Hulk movie, and oddly, the way this is structured, you can almost see it as a sequel to that movie as well as being an MCU movie. It kind of serves as a bit of a bridge, I would say. Land of the Lost with Will Ferrell and Danny McBride. It's alright. The Dark Knight. What is to be said about The Dark Knight? It's unbelievable. Why would these people be fighting over Maggie Gyllenhaal like that? Your Highness, an underrated movie. I personally, just from my memories of role-playing games in my teen years, way back in the day, it's that sort of ribald, raunchy humor that comes up in an actual role-playing game, so in a way it feels appropriate to have it in your fantasy film, and makes it one of the better D&D movies out there. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. I mean, overall, the modern-day Planet of the Apes series, I've not seen the most recent one, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, but the trilogy with Caesar, pretty solid movies, and far better than most reboots have any right to be. I'm still maybe slightly more of a fan of the original Planet of the Apes movie, with Charlton Heston, not just from nostalgia, but there is elements to how that story is structured and its themes that I like that weren't quite there in these versions of the Planet of the Apes, but these are definitely far better than the sequels to the original Planet of the Apes, especially those that were trying to sketch out the rise of the Planet of the Apes, which was the title of one of them, wasn't it? Well, never mind. Going on. The Mist. I know it has its decriers. I still think it was a pretty solid movie, and one of the most Stephen King endings I've ever seen committed to film, in spite of the fact that apparently it's not actually the ending that was there in the short story it was based upon. Apparently in that one, they're just lost in the mist forever. But I found the whole twist of the guy capping his son and then realizing it was for nothing if they had just waited another 5 minutes. I mean, that's up there with the ending of Cujo, which they didn't do in the movie. The OG Guardians of the Galaxy. Farscape, the Marvel movie, in other words. It's definitely one of the upper tier Marvel movies, and I wouldn't call it overrated at all. Let's see, Step Brothers. Possibly the peak of Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly working together as probably this movie right here. Ice Pirates, a B-movie classic from the 80s that I loved a lot as a kid, and I quite enjoy being able to watch it every once in a while. It's dumb, it's problematic in a few ways by modern standards, but I don't know, it's still fun and cheesy, and it's one of those movies that does deserve a reboot because there's potential there for goodness that wasn't able to be done due to constraints of budget and special effects at the time. A Million Ways to Die in the West, from Seth MacFarlane's little stab at trying to become a Hollywood director, but vastly overshadowed by his success with the first Ted movie. I mean, it's not as bad as some people make it out to be, but it wasn't great. I mean, let's be fair here. Red Sonja, technically a bad movie, but also one of those nostalgia, sword and sorcery childhood favorites that, yes, as an adult, you know, it's dumb, but you like it anyway. The OG Conan, the Barbarian, that is. I mean, what's to be said about that? That movie's a classic. Tusk. Technically, this might have been the last Kevin Smith movie I've ever actually sat all the way through. I used to be a big Kevin Smith fan, but I tend not to go back and find myself drawn to watching Clerks or Clerks 2 or Chasing Amy or any of those sorts of movies anymore. There was a time in my life, though, when, you know, he was certainly an influential person. I mean, I probably wouldn't have worked so many years at 7-Eleven if it hadn't been for Clerks making that seem like it was a cool thing to do when I was a teenager. This movie, I mean, in spite of its many oddities, I will say just for my shock value, like, it does actually maybe qualify for being a decent horror movie just because of how much it burns certain images in your head for a couple days after you first see it. The first time they reveal what happened to Justin Long, when you see him in walrus form through the little porthole window of the door, like, that stuck with me for a bit, and, you know, that's an accomplishment for a film to pull off. Not likely to ever want to watch it again, though, so it's probably a waste of $10. Aliens, the classic. One of the best sequels ever made. Not really much else to say about it. Who the fuck doesn't like Aliens? Blazing Saddles, one of Mel Brooks' best movies, hands down. And an American classic. To those who say it can't be made again today, well, why would you want it to? Like, a new rebooted version of Blazing Saddles is doomed to suck. You can't get lightning in a bottle twice. You know, so just watch the original one right here. The Other Guys. As far as Will Ferrell comedy vessels go, especially pairing up with Mark Wahlberg, I'd say this one's actually pretty underrated and underappreciated. It has a lot of good moments in it. The Lord of the Rings trilogy, you can just kind of package all three of these together. I was very trepidatious of the Lord of the Rings movies coming out because it was the guy who made Meet the Feebles, and as much as people like the Frighteners, I wasn't as enamored with the Frighteners as other people, and so I was just kept thinking about the guy who made that horrible Muppet movie is going to make Lord of the Rings. This is going to be terrible. And it turned out to be, once again, like, way better than anybody had any right to expect. You know, is it a perfect translation of the books? No, but, I mean, it's about as good as you can hope for. Of the three, I'd probably like Fellowship of the Ring because it's probably the most faithful to the books. The Two Towers is a weird, boring, schizophrenic slog because they intercut both halves of the books together to go, you know, in a linear storytelling fashion, which makes sense from my movie perspective, but it's weird that they cut off both endings of both storylines and added stuff we didn't really need. I guess they felt that they had to establish more about the people of Rohan, but I don't know why that had to include Aragorn falling off a cliff and other dubious decisions made. And, you know, Return of the King was alright. Took too long to end, though, even with them leaving out the Scouring of the Shire. By that point, having seen it on opening day in theaters, it's like, yeah, I wasn't gonna want to sit through another half hour of Hobbits at that point. Like, hurry the hell up so I can get out of this crowded theater and use the bathroom. Blade Runner, the final cut. I'm not sure if I'd sign on as this being any better than any of the other various cuts of Blade Runner. Blade Runner overall is a great movie. I do appreciate the versions that do not have the narration from Harrison Ford, though. Puts you a bit more into the mind space of the characters, because you're having to force yourself to think along with them instead of just having it all spoon-fed to you. Talladega Nights, it's alright. I liked it more when it first came out. Step Brothers kind of blew it out of the water, in my opinion. but it was still, solid Will Ferrell vessel. Balls of Fury, underappreciated, not great, but underappreciated nonetheless. The fucking Hobbit movies. Do I really have to talk about these video games brought to life? So many weird decisions. A lot of it you can chalk up to the fact that originally this was supposed to be a two-part movie series done by, not Benicio del Toro, the other del Toro guy, Guillermo del Toro. But it ended up, famously being handed back over to Peter Jackson and dragged way the hell out, and they still managed to screw things up. Miss story beats. I feel like they ruined the whole Bjorn section. They kind of screwed up the bit with the trolls in the first one. There's just so many little things. That ludicrous escape from the wood elves and the barrels, the way they portrayed it in these movies. We're catering too much to the dumb members of the audience by making things action-packed and exciting that are not supposed to be action-packed and exciting. They're supposed to be moody. The Zero Theorem, Terry Gilliam film. On the scale of Terry Gilliam films, I'd rate it maybe like a low 7.25, something like that. It's worth watching, especially if you like Christoph Waltz. But, it's no Brazil, or, some of his other more famous films. Time After Time, solid kind of reinterpretation and spin on H.G. Wells's Time Machine story. Worth watching. Basically, it's about H.G. Wells with a time machine, hooking up with some chick in San Francisco in the 60s and all that kind of good stuff. The Dark Knight Rises. This movie, unfortunately, is always going to be forever tainted to me. I was working just around the corner from the Aurora 16 theater when The Dark Knight Rises came out, the night that James Holmes went in and shot the place up. And so I wasn't like directly there, but I was like a secondary witness to the fallout of all that, just from, out of nowhere, just all these cop cars just racing down the street and blocking off the street and basically shutting down my ability to have customers for most of the night. And ambulances and FBI people showing up to make sure that no one was in the building, so a lady who got shot could use the bathroom. And then this whole big group of high school kids comes wandering up together as a group because they got tired of waiting around for their parents and let them have some free Slurpees and shit. And yeah, it was quite a night, and I did not go to movie theaters for a long time. And I would like to think that my dislike of The Dark Knight Rises out of the, Chris Nolan Batman trilogy is entirely just based upon its own internal story beats, but there's got to be some discoloration that comes from the human experience of the movie's premiere. X-Men Days of Future Past, the last good X-Men movie. The Interview. I haven't watched this in a while. I don't really know if this holds up very well, but it was alright when it came out. Zardoz, one of those infamous on the internet bad movies that I think is underappreciated. You kind of have to watch it like a novel and extend your own imagination into it to kind of compensate for their inability to have special effects to convey any of the things and themes and ideas and technologies that were on display in this movie. Another movie that I actually think could stand to have a remake if the right people are involved. Heavy Metal 2000. I know this might be sacrilegious, but I like this one more than the original Heavy Metal. Peter Laird from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fame directed and set up most of it, and it was pretty good. Inception, not my favorite Christopher Nolan movie, not by far. Not the one I dislike the most, but I put it as low tier and overhyped when it came out. John Carter, underappreciated, a little too long, but it was still an underappreciated movie that people want to just blame, on things like not naming it John Carter of Mars, or not naming it a Princess of Mars, or having Taylor Kitsch be the star, or Disney not really marketing enough. I think the only reason Disney made this was to convince George Lucas that they could handle making Star Wars, but that's just my own personal theory. And so in a way, it didn't really matter to them if it didn't hit at the box office, because they're really only interested in one audience member's opinion. Screamers, a little classic Peter Weller, the more sci-fi type of Philip K. Dick kind of story. It was alright. I remember it being popular when I was in junior high. Role Models, technically a bad comedy, but if you were into live action role playing at any point in your life, or role playing games in general, there's a nostalgia angle that this movie has that's inescapable. The original Dune, R.I.P. David Lynch. People make fun of it, but when I was a kid, this was one of my favorite movies, and if this movie hadn't been out, I wouldn't have tried reading the novel Dune when I was only 8. V for Vendetta. This movie's fucking held up well now, hasn't it? The Last Unicorn. One of the most realistic fairy tales ever committed to film. Wonderful ending. Absolutely wonderful ending. The classic 80s Flash Gordon. Also, one of those guilty pleasures, technically. Not a good movie, but also it's fucking awesome somehow. So, deal with that. The Road Warrior. Possibly my favorite movie of all time. Ed Wood. The inspirational Tim Burton movie, one of his last really good movies that he made, starring Johnny Depp as the titular Ed Wood, one of the worst filmmakers of all time. Flesh and Blood, a Rutger Hauer classic, also directed by Paul Verhoeven, set in Renaissance Italy. Very good. Do not watch it with your kids and family, though. John Wick, proof that a simple plot can carry a franchise pretty fucking far. I would have been happy if they only ever made the one. Blades of Glory, another movie from the heyday of Will Ferrell comedies. Avatar. At this point in James Cameron's career, he should have just stuck with doing deep sea diving stuff. Like, that these movies make the amount of money they make, to me, is not really a great sign about society in general and the kinds of things that gain popularity. Always remember that the majority of people are dumb or average intelligence, and so, making billions of dollars in theaters isn't necessarily the sign that it's of high quality. X2, X-Men United. Another one of the best X-Men, easily. Probably the first one I really liked. I was kind of ho-hum on the original X-Men movie, but X2 did a good job at portraying some of the spirit of the comics, even if you would not call them comic accurate. X-Men First Class, another top-tier X-Men movie from the 20th Century Fox days. Transformers Dark of the Moon, also known as the premiere of Optimus War Crimes. They Live, yet another classic, very memeable movie, very relevant, and will probably remain relevant for quite some time. The Wolverine, of the solo Wolverine movies, yeah, it's probably my favorite. I know people like Logan a lot. I find it maybe just a bit too grim. Technically a better movie, but this is a movie I'm more likely to want to watch than Logan. The Invention of Lying, from the heyday of Ricky Gervais's career, a pretty insightful and underappreciated comedy. I've already described my feelings on the Hobbit movies, bloated and full of dumb shit. Clash of the Titans, another classic with some of Ray Harryhausen's best work. Batman Begins, the middle tier of the Christopher Nolan Batman movies. Exodus, Gods and Kings. Ridley Scott went through a period there, didn't he? Hellboy, the original one with Ron Perlman, just a solid movie. Solid comic book movie. Krull, one of those cheesy, weird B-movie fantasy Star Wars ripoffs from the 80s that actually has legs and is also on the list of things that could stand to be rebooted and have some money poured into it because the original one just didn't quite get there. The Departed, I liked it more the first few times I watched it. Last time I tried watching it, I got kind of bored 30 minutes into it and turned it off. I do say it's some of Mark Wahlberg's best performing, even though he's barely in the movie, but he steals the scene quite often with the way he plays his character. Nightcrawler, probably my favorite Jake Gyllenhaal movie. Mel Gibson's Braveheart, a classic, if maybe a little worn out from overviewing. Ghostbusters, a classic, if maybe a little worn out from overviewing, and has caused a lot of trouble in recent decade because of Hollywood's intention of trying to somehow milk more money out of it. But once again, it's a lightning in the bottle situation, so, you're never really going to quite recapture the magic, no matter how hard you try. The Postman, an underrated Kevin Costner movie, from around that post-Waterworld time period, when people were getting a little tired of him. It's long, there's parts of it that are a little cheesy, but overall, as far as post-apocalyptic movies and portrayals of, a post-apocalyptic American society, I don't think it's all that far off the mark in terms of, what things might be like. Riddick, the third of the Riddick movies, probably the best since it tries to just stick to what made Pitch Black good and dialing down the stuff from Chronicles of Riddick. Just stick them on a planet with some monsters to fight and let it go from there. We don't need a bunch of cheesy role-playing game crap. Green Lantern, lousy. Chronicles of Riddick, like I said, it's not horrible, but feels more like a pilot for a TV show. A really short TV show where they just made 3 episodes and just jammed them all together into one episode with a huge budget. It's not terrible. There's aspects to it I like, but I'm not going to pretend like it's some Shakespearean masterpiece. Tropic Thunder, one of the best comedies ever made, period, hands down, holds up incredibly well. John Carpenter's The Thing. Like most of the, especially the heyday of John Carpenter's career, it's one of the best horror movies ever made. Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, people laugh at some of its sillier aspects, but I don't know, it's one of my favorite movies. The Adventures of Robin Hood, the original with Errol Flynn. If you want to be able to understand Robin Hood Men in Tights, or a lot of stuff about Robin Hood, this is one of the essential ones to watch, and actually still might actually be one of the best versions of Robin Hood. Superman Returns, with Kevin Spacey as Lex Luthor, that attempt to try to resurrect the actual Christopher Reeve continuity of Superman movies, a failed experiment of sorts. It was alright, but it wasn't exciting, and I guess that was part of its problem. Okay, the Star Wars quintology, or the hell it's up to now. Remember the good old days when we could like Star Wars movies? Even the prequels, with as much as complaining as they caused, they didn't split the fandom up the way Disney ultimately did. Ghost of Mars, a movie from the back half of John Carpenter's film career, when things weren't going quite as well. It's a cheesy B science fiction movie, and on that level it's fine, but it's definitely not one of his masterpieces. The original Thor. This was the movie that probably actually got me to go ahead and say fuck it and sign on to following the MCU. I was standoffish over the Iron Man films. But, I don't know, just maybe it's a combination of Kenneth Branagh directing it and J. Michael Straczynski writing it. But I like the ending. It was also the least obvious case of Marvel where the hero is fighting basically just a mirror reflection of himself. Loki's also a god, but he's a very radically different god, so it's not like Iron Man punching another guy in an Iron Man suit kind of bullshit. The original Matrix, one of the best movies of all time. It's been talked to ad infinitum on the internet. I don't really know if I have anything particularly to add to the conversation beyond that. It's a good movie. Man of Steel does not hold up. Didn't hold up when it came out. I know people really like Henry Cavill, and that's fine. You're allowed to. I don't dislike him. He's alright. But this started just the worst period of DC in film. It began with this movie right here, so it can go fuck itself. The Watchmen. I liked it. I know some people, hardcore Watchmen graphic novel fans, have their reasons to bitch about it, but as far as Snyder films go, it was pretty good, and that's why I say he works better if he actually has a specific comic book to recreate, as opposed to just freeballing it himself like he did with Man of Steel. In the Name of the Rose, a solid book, a solid movie. Watch it. Westworld is a terrible, terrible movie. Terribly made, terribly paced, terribly acted, but it has really strong ideas that have obviously managed to carry it forward into its modern-day incarnation. The Green Hornet sucked. Horror of Dracula, one of your classic Hammer horror depictions of Dracula, most of which are at least worth watching just for the fun of it. I wouldn't call them the best movies ever. Just classic, cheesy horror movies from the 60s with nice buxom English ladies. The original Mad Max holds up really well. in some ways. In others, it's a really slow-paced movie that doesn't explain much about what's going on, so I can see how modern audiences might not enjoy it as much as some of the other Mad Max entries, but it is essential. Spies Like Us, a classic 80s comedy. Well worth watching, still holds up pretty well. The Fearless Vampire Killers. This was a vampire movie starring Roman Polanski from the 60s, worth watching. Sin City: A Dame to Kill For, the sequel to the original Sin City, which I didn't really care for this movie all that much, so I guess we'll just move on to Excalibur. I consider Excalibur to be a bit overrated in people's minds. However, it is probably the best film incarnation of the Arthurian legend. Captain Blood, another classic Errol Flynn movie that is worth watching if you can get your hands on it. Outland, an underrated Sean Connery science fiction movie. It's actually pretty realistically hard sci-fi, all things considered. Probably due for a remake of some form or another. Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. It's another Hammer horror version of Dracula. Godzilla from 2014. I was disappointed with it. A lot of people were disappointed with it. But Godzilla movies aren't good anyway, except with some very rare exceptions, mostly only those from Japan. Most of the things that you could complain about it, where there wasn't enough Godzilla and too much crap about humans you don't care about, well, that is true of most of your classic Toho Godzilla movies too. There's an awful lot of, following around some reporter or scientist, and then the occasional scene of Godzilla doing some action, and then back to like another 30 minutes of journalists and scientists trying to figure things out. And so on that front, it's a typical Godzilla movie. But with CGI and modern standards, I can see why people resonate maybe a bit more with the Kong versus Godzilla movies, because they actually give you a significant amount of screen time with these monster characters. Jaws, one of the greatest movies of all time. Wolfen, an underrated werewolf movie. One of my favorite werewolf movies, largely because there's actually no real werewolves in it, depending on how you were defining werewolf. 30 minutes or less is completely forgettable. Lethal Weapon. It's a classic. We wouldn't have the Mel Gibson we have today if it hadn't been for this movie. The Watch was alright. I haven't seen it in a while. I don't know if it really holds up all that well, but it was alright at the time it came out, and I've seen it a few times. Pitch Black, I've already mentioned how I feel about Riddick. It might be the best of the Riddick movies just because, Riddick really isn't the main character. He's just part of an ensemble of characters, which is something that the sequels are lacking. Ivanhoe. Yeah, it turned out to be kind of boring. The Crimson Pirate was alright in terms of classic pirate movies. Die Hard, everyone's favorite Christmas movie. Terminator 2, Judgment Day, just a bunch of DEI feminist crap. Ex Machina, yeah, the robot's fuckable. I mean, that's really about all there is to report from this movie. Jason and the Argonauts, it's sort of the prototype to Clash of the Titans, well worth watching, it's a classic. Batman Returns, yet another one of your kind of oddball Christmas movies if you're looking for something untraditional to put on during the season. Batman Mask of the Phantasm. I agree with the people who say that this is one of the better Batman theatrical released movies. I remember watching it in theaters when it came out. The Black Rose. I never finished this. My mom said it was good, but maybe one of these days I'll get around to watching it again. Since she's dead, and I can't get her to recommend movies to me anymore. Dirty Harry, the original. It's a classic for a reason. The first Ted was alright, the second one sucked. Prometheus. Another one of those movies I feel has kind of already been nitpicked a lot on the internet, so I don't really know what there is to say about it that you don't already know. It had a lot of potential, and there are things about it that are cool and interesting and thought-provoking, but there's also an awful lot about it that's nonsensical and breaks the setting. So as far as prequels go, I don't really think it rates well. The Star Wars prequels might be better. There, I said it. The Return of the Joker for Batman Beyond. Pretty solid direct-to-video Batman Beyond movie. The original X-Men, as I already kind of mentioned, it was alright, but I didn't really quite fall on the hype train until its sequel came out. The Mutiny on the Bounty with Marlon Brando was a pretty good adaptation of Mutiny on the Bounty. It goes hand in hand with The Bounty from the 80s. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. I will defend this movie. This movie was pretty hype in the 90s when it came out, and there's still some sort of nostalgia angle to it, I guess, that makes me like it. But, as I said earlier, the Errol Flynn Robin Hood is technically a better version of Robin Hood. This depiction of Robin Hood, though, has definitely had echoes into other depictions of Robin Hood that have come since. Troy, a little movie that could. Didn't seem to come out to a lot of critical acclaim and fanfare, but it's held up in terms of, like movie-going culture. People still like to reference it and talk about it. So, as far as modern day, classic epics go, it's probably one of the better ones. A Clockwork Orange. Saw this movie when I was way too young because my mom just thought it was a science fiction movie because it was in the science fiction section of the video store. Definitely not something you should watch when you're at the age of 7. However, of various science fiction projections of what the future would be, actually it ended up turning out to be more accurate than most people would have thought during most of this movie's tenure. Transformers the original. Fuck you, Michael Bay. Transformers Revenge of the Fallen. I actually kind of like this one. I find it weird that everyone hates on this one so much compared to the other Transformers. I don't really think it's any better or worse than any of them. Robin Hood with Russell Crowe really stank. It really fucking stank. Star Wars The Force Awakens. The great bait that lured so many people into a trap that was snapped on them with the release of The Last Jedi. Mad Max Fury Road is a solid fucking film. The Rocky Horror Picture Show. Definitely another influential movie. The remake they tried to do a couple years ago pales in comparison to the perfection of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Rambo First Blood. I don't know why they have the Rambo First Blood Part 2 thing here on the box, because this is supposed to be First Blood, which is really the only Rambo movie I really like, was the original Rambo. But I'm a cheerleader. I don't know, I had a crush on the main girl when this movie had come out. Akira. I wish they hadn't redone the English language audio dub, because I miss the original voices, and also the dialogue has been changed somewhat, but Akira still holds up as being one of the greatest anime movies ever made, for a good reason. The first Deadpool, the Deadpool movies aren't bad, but I'm like way over Ryan Reynolds. He's in too much shit. Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice. Everything I said about Man of Steel applies to this. It's crap. Everyone knew it was crap. And it just kept snowballing into the monster that era of the DC cinematic universe became. Justice League, The New Frontier. It's a pretty decent Justice League direct-to-video animated movie. Robin Hood, Men in Tights. Possibly Mel Brooks' last good movie. The original Planet of the Apes. Solid classic sci-fi, proper sci-fi that makes you think about shit. The OG Highlander. A solid lightning in the bottle B movie that resonated with people in terms of video rental. And despite the fact that it's spun off mini sequels and even a TV show, nothing has ever really truly managed to capture the magic that the original had. Rise of the Planet of the Apes. I've already discussed my thoughts on Planet of the Apes. Speed. Several years ago I realized that Speed's one of those movies that if it just happens to be on, I will sit through it. I remember seeing it in theaters when it came out. It's just a dumb testosterone action movie from the 90s, but it hits all the beats and it doesn't leave you hanging too long where you start getting bored and restless. It's pretty relentless. And like I said, it's one of those movies we'll watch pretty much any time if it's on. The Mummy with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. It was kind of surprising how much this movie popped off when it came out, and it still holds up as one of the better renditions of the classic Hollywood horror Mummy tale. The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai. It's a weird movie. It's a very, very weird movie. Decades ahead of its time in many ways, adding to its weirdness, but it's probably easier to appreciate it now than it was at the time it came out. Star Trek Beyond. Of the modern trilogy of Star Trek movies, this is the only one I find even remotely alright to watch. Captain America Civil War, aka Avengers 2.5. This movie has caused so much trouble for the MCU ever since. Transformers the movie, the animated, from the 80s. I saw this in theaters when I was a kid. Went through all the trauma of watching Optimus Prime die, which actually didn't bother me that much. I was fine with the new cast of Transformers. So I don't know. I mean, I'd already seen A Clockwork Orange. Like, there's nothing in Transformers the movie that was going to shock me. Still, though, without question, the best Transformer movie that has been made. The Wicker Man. What a wonderful, quirky little horror movie that unfortunately was remade terribly with Nicolas Cage. That changed so many aspects of it as to be just almost irrecognizable compared to what this is. If you've never seen the original Wicker Man, I highly recommend it. Curse of Frankenstein, a Hammer horror movie about Frankenstein. It's pretty solid. Maximum Overdrive, a movie that's way overhated. This was a great movie. Maximum Overdrive rules. It fucking rules. Michael Moore in Trumpland, one of those you only gonna watch it once at the time it came out. Idiocracy, the first movie I bought after Donald Trump won the first time. X-Men Apocalypse, what a appropriate follow-up to Idiocracy, not one of the good X-Men movies. Sausage Party, also not one of the good X-Men movies. Jupiter Ascending, better than people give it credit for. I wish I had been younger when it came out, because I probably really would have liked this as a kid, less so much as an adult. It does have a really interesting Terry Gilliam bureaucracy scene, and it is full of ideas that, you know, could have led to something, but it's... the Wachowskis never seem to really emerge from their Matrix period with their feet under them. Of course, you know, they have their own issues, so go figure. Captain America, the First Avenger. Yeah, it's one of the early solid MCU movies post the first couple of Iron Men when they were still getting their legs under them. Still holds up. Scrooged, a great Bill Murray retelling of A Christmas Carol, worth watching. Spaceballs. Yeah, one of my all-time favorite Mel Brooks movies, if not one of the best Star Wars movies ever made. David Carradine in Circle of Iron. This movie was supposed to have been a Bruce Lee movie, but Bruce Lee died, and so they made it with David Carradine, and it's weird, and it's really bogged down in the middle act of the film, but it has a wonderful Zen ending, though, that I can't recommend higher. So, like I said, just be prepared to have to, like, get through a chunk of the middle in order to be able to enjoy the bookends of the beginning and the end of the movie. Justice League Dark was okay. I've never felt like watching it again. Doctor Strangelove is one of your great classics. Stanley Kubrick film. Holds up so incredibly well. It's definitely worth a watch. Doctor Strange was okay. X-Men The Last Stand was long decried as one of the worst X-Men movies. However, because of how they did their more recent reboot of The Dark Phoenix, X-Men The Last Stand might actually have risen a bit in the ranks because of that, in terms of bad interpretations of the Dark Phoenix saga go. Starship Troopers, another one of the internet's favorite films, and for good reason. Rogue One. Some would say this is probably the only decent Star Wars movie that Disney has made, and it is one of the ones that came from an idea that kind of slightly predated Disney buying Lucasfilm, so go figure. Ran. It's an Akira Kurosawa film. It's not The Seven Samurai, but it's worth watching. It's got a lot of good visuals and all that kind of stuff, and story based on what was it? King Lear. Was it King Lear? It was one of those fucking Shakespeare plays. The original RoboCop, enough said. Ninja Assassin, underrated, it's worth watching. The Edge, this was a great movie, some of Alec Baldwin's best acting ever, I shit you not. Logan, I already talked about Logan. Logan was good, but it doesn't exactly lend itself to a lot of friendly rewatching because it's heavy and ends gut-punchingly. The Lego Batman movie was alright. The Mummy Returns, which for some reason has the logo for the Tom Cruise Mummy, even though it's the one with The Rock in it and the Scorpion King, was an alright sequel. Unfortunately, it led to those terrible Scorpion King movies. Kong Skull Island was pretty good, and of the current batch of monster movies, it might actually be my favorite of them, more so even than the Kong vs. Godzilla ones. Goodfellas. It's probably Martin Scorsese's peak film. And I think we're going to end off this particular batch of movies with Aqua Teen Hunger Force: the movie, which is pretty goddamn terrible, but it's Aqua Teen. It's supposed to be terrible. Aqua Teen is the Seinfeld of late-night stoner comedy cartoon shows. It's about nothing and about terrible people.